Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
Welcome to episode 1724. So we will have the second part of my interview with Lynette today. This is the longer side of that interview where we discuss a variety of interesting topics. However, it is absolutely amazing what a surprise this whole situation has been for the world, for the real estate market, for the financial markets over the last 18 months or so. And I'm looking at an article now in FT, Financial Times. Of course, we've had some of their reporters and writers on over the years, not the least of which is Gillian Tett. She's fantastic. And this article is entitled, Pandemic Fuels Broadest Global House Price Boom in 2 Decades. And this is a Financial Times series, FT, Low Interest Rates and Extra Savings. That's also been a counterintuitive thing. Have boosted the market, reviving debate over financial stability. So, of course, you know, because you are more aware than most people, even the experts, even those people you see on television, even those people you read about in major news media, you are more aware of what is going on because you ask the most important question in life whenever you're looking at stuff like this. You ask the question, compared to what? That is the most important question in life. And by the way, I would love to hear some counterpoint on that, some commentary on that. Do you agree or do you disagree? Just go real quickly over to jasonhartman.com/ask and tell me what you think about that question that you have dubbed the Jason Hartman question, compared to what? Because there are so many people out there who are talking about the housing market and comparing it to the prior peak before the global financial crisis. And these comparisons are so amazingly inaccurate. I can't even believe it. It's like I'm watching the news and I want to throw a brick at the television. Where do these people get their half-baked ideas? And that's the right word for it, half-baked. You know, a lot of these opinions you hear and you see and you read, they're just half-baked. They're not a complete thought. They don't make any sense. And hey, that's what we have to contend with. But look, this is not opinion. This is just reporting, right, in this article. And maybe next week or something we'll dive into this more deeply because it really is quite interesting. But you look at all of these major economies around the world, whether it be, and they've got these charts on housing prices in all these economies. I'll just rattle several of them off to you. Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Chile, Colombia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany. Now Greece, although Greece is a little different, okay, because they've got the OECD house prices, and then they've got the country index, and Greece is one that diverges pretty significantly, so we'll see about that one. Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, even Japan, right? Think about that. Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, the UK, the US, the Eurozone, Brazil, Now, Brazil's got a pretty big divergence. I do want to tell you that one. And when I'm looking at these two things on the chart, whether it be countries' index for their housing prices or the OECD index. So big divergence in Greece and Brazil, well, New Zealand also, but the divergence is in the other direction between the two stats. So Bulgaria, China, India, Indonesia, Romania, Russia, South Africa. And by the way, I must tell you that your host, yes, yours truly, has been to every single one of these countries, some of them many times. So I do have an understanding of those real estate markets. I've met with brokers in many of those countries, and well, the Euro area, as they're calling it, not the Eurozone. I've been to many of those countries, but they also single many of those economies out. And it's just basically saying that the housing market has just taken off in all of those countries. So this is not just a U.S. thing, but the U.S., again, in a very special position, enjoying the world's reserve currency ever since Bretton Woods back in 1944, that famous meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, where that system, there are still vestiges of it, obviously, but that system really was the system of the world's money until 1971, until Nixon took us off the gold standard. And that anniversary coming right up here, just right around the corner, where it will be 50 years, 5 decades since Nixon, in his famous or infamous, I'll say it's infamous, not famous, speech, said he would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, half a century ago. So nothing so permanent as a temporary government program, right? So yeah, it's just really quite fascinating. So see if we can take a deeper dive into this article, because it really is fascinating, but it just shows you what is going on around the world with housing prices there. It's absolutely staggering what's happened. But again, it's not the price of the house that matters. It's the payment on the house. And with interest rates less than half of what they were before the Great Recession, it's a completely different world. And the rent-to-value ratio, that rule of thumb, that staple that I have taught you for, 18, 19 years now, it ain't what it used to be. It's just not as meaningful as it used to be, because the structure of the debt service on those properties is so much lower. It's an extraordinary time. It really is. So no, I don't think there's any huge bubble, unless you want to just say there's an everything bubble, then maybe. But these housing payments are so low and so reasonable. It's just, it's just a very interesting, unique, and different time. Okay, be sure you have registered and purchased your tickets for Empowered Investor Live. I'm super excited about this event. We've got some great speakers lined up. And by the way, one of the things we're trying to do with this event, unlike the other events, is, and I read all of your evaluations. When we ask you to submit an evaluation for our events, I read them all. I read every word. And I appreciate that all of you absolutely love our events. I mean, the feedback is just insanely positive every time we do a live event. So I very much appreciate that. However, the one bit of feedback that I have noticed as a thread is people saying, and by the way, I appreciate this and I'm humbled, because I see this on the evaluations, I hear this when I talk to you from your feedback. Jason, I want to hear more from you. I want to hear more of what you think and you say. You have so many speakers and it's great. You have all these awesome speakers, but leave a little more time for your content. And so that's what we've really tried to do with this upcoming event, is leave a little more. That's why we haven't announced a bunch of big speakers like we've had at other events, because we're trying in the schedule, still working out the schedule and so forth, still adding a few speakers and such, but we're trying to leave a little more time for our content, and especially this time, a deep dive into our relatively new index, the Hartman Comparison Index, because there's a lot to this. We now have a white paper that is 19 pages long. I don't know if you even call that a white paper anymore. Maybe you just call it a book, a mini book, or a report. It's bigger than a white paper. And why is it so long? What is there to this? Well, it depends. What is our base year for comparison? If we're asking compared to what, we've got to pick base years. So we picked two base years. One is 1970 and the other is 2000 as our base years to use the comparison index. And then do we normalize the data or do we just make the data raw, right? There are a lot of decisions we've had to make. We're working with our team. Our in-house economist, Thomas, who you've heard on the show, has been really helpful in brainstorming some of these ideas about the index and how it should be used, presented, all of the different things. So we're going to take a deep dive into that at Empowered Investor Live. So I'm really excited. Go to empoweredinvestor.com. Get your tickets right away. You still got early bird pricing. empoweredinvestor.com. All right. Without further ado, let's get to part 2 of my discussion with Lynette Zang and just dive into this stuff a little bit deeper. Here we go. It's really easy when the government is in dire straits to go take all of the retirement plans, the 401ks and the IRAs, and all that money in those plans is basically in brokerage accounts.
Right.
And they can just make an edict, even an executive order possibly. They'll engineer a crisis or take advantage of a crisis that they might even be complicit in, or crisis will just happen. And then for our own protection, the government will have to step in. And of course, who's going to administrate that? A big tech company, along with the government. They're of course in bed together. And when they do that, they will retitle those accounts to the government, and then they will just inflate the value of them away so that you might get your government stipend, your stimulus in nominal dollars, but in real dollars, it's almost meaningless. And listen, you don't have to believe me. It's already been happening for decades.
I was going to say, Poland did that right after 2008, and they went in and they took, I think it was 50% of everything that was in the private retirement plans. And even our government, and I haven't looked at this in a little while, so I should go in and see the chatter because there's a lot of chatter coming up around pension plans again. But they discussed having an 11.47 one-off event. Because if you only think they're going to do it once, then you don't change behavior. So the way they're going to position is we're only going to do this once, and it is, again, for your protection. But what about real estate taxes?
Well, the nice thing about real estate taxes is they are very fragmented among over 3,100 counties in the United States. So that's pretty hard to coordinate. Now, at the federal level, Sleepy Joe Biden wants to reduce the opportunity for investors to use the 1031 tax-deferred exchange. Who knows if he'll get that through, but he wants to limit the deferral benefit on that. When people sell properties, they can buy other investment properties and trade them all their life tax-free. It's a fantastic deal. Income property, at least currently, is the most tax-favored asset class in America. And he wants to limit that to $500,000 per year. But Lynette, I think he's going to have a pretty hard time making that happen because the big giant corporations are in the real estate business in a big way. They're now in the single family home business in a big way. But before, they've always been in the apartment complex business, the retail shopping center business, the office space business. But now they're doing single family homes by the tens of thousands. Invitation Homes, for example, and American Homes for Rent. Yeah.
And so we've heard from the World Economic Forum, you will own nothing and be happy. So that's certainly part of it, is where you live, right? And so then these big corporations can then dictate how much you're going to pay. And if everything's digital, it's easy enough for them to take it out.
It sure is. It sure is. And so we'll see where that goes. But as far as the big companies in the single family home business, that number is definitely increasing. But in relation to the overall market size, it is like a drop in a bucket. It's nothing yet. It is increasing, But so far, it's still a very, very small number. There's approximately 18 million single family rental homes in the country owned by mom and pop investors. And, the number owned by institutions is really a very small number. It is growing though, so it's something to keep an eye on.
Well, and I've read a lot of documents when you're talking about the mom and pops. Of course, we've had the rent moratoriums that came in, but the costs, the taxes, the insurance, those other things keep going on. And so mom and pops, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you know this area better than I do, but the mom and pops are getting squeezed out. And you're also looking at prices, nominal prices of these properties at, insane levels again, which corporations don't really care because they're borrowing that money for zero and then basically turning around and taking that debt and turning it into a Wall Street product and selling off the risk.
Right.
Is that what you're seeing?
That is what we're seeing, but again, it's not that big a deal yet. However, it is increasing. As far as the moratoriums, I was commenting on that, interestingly, on Monday night on RT News, as we talked about. And then literally the next day, after I was talking on the news about how they were ending the moratoriums, they put them back into effect through the CDC now. Did anybody ever imagine that the Center for Disease Control would be dictating rental housing policy?
I couldn't have imagined that. Honestly, I couldn't have. It's kind of insane.
I'm dumbfounded,
Right.
These are crazy times. They really are. So basically what's happening in so many ways in our life, not just with rental housing, just they're doing it from every angle you can imagine. It's a taking, okay? Right. It's a taking.
It's a wealth transfer.
It's a wealth transfer. It's a centralization of power and control. All of these things are very worrisome.
Yeah, they really are. But do you think, with the scarcity of properties on the market, do you think that the corporations going in and buying big tracts of home, it's, isn't it making it almost impossible, especially for a first-time home buyer? And that percentage of mortgage debt is really, the mortgage boom is driving debt levels for individuals that are buying their own homes to new heights.
Yeah, that's sort of a complicated issue because you really have a lot of layers to peel back on that onion, if you will. It seems like housing prices are high. However, I would argue that they're not very high in comparison to many commodities. Now, I think the first one we should maybe talk about is gold.
It's gold. And you had a great table on that.
I do. And what's really interesting here, Lynette, is to see how powerful gold has been as an insurance policy to maintain purchasing power over decades. Of course, the big change happened in the 1970s, and the 1970s was a really interesting decade for economists. It wasn't a good one, but it's a really interesting one to study because a lot happened. First of all, of course, as all your audience knows, Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971 and ended the last vestige of convertibility from the dollar to gold. And that meant that the government really had no tether anymore. They could do whatever they wanted in terms of their irresponsible spending. My favorite president of my lifetime was Ronald Reagan, and he had this great quote. He used to say that the government spends like a drunken sailor is an insult to drunken sailors. And so as the government has racked up the debt, it has created a lot of inflationary pressure in the system. And the 70s and the early 80s were the worst of that until our former Fed Chair Paul Volcker came along and broke the back of inflation by just tightening the money supply to levels never seen before. But he had the guts to do it, and I got to give him a lot of credit for that. So if you go back to 1970, the year before Nixon took us off the gold standard, gold, as you know, was $35 an ounce. The median home price back then was just over $22,000. So if you wanted to buy the median price home in gold, it would cost 646 ounces of gold. Okay. Now, the problem we get into when people try to evaluate what anything is worth is they only use one measuring stick. They only compare it to one thing. And that's a huge mistake. They compare it to just dollars.
Right.
Why would we just use dollars? That's crazy. Nobody cares about dollars. They only care about what dollars buy them. That's
actually what really matters.
That's
what
what
they
really
buy.
matters. And so an ounce of gold will buy you a lot more, and it hasn't been debased like the dollar has. So in 1970, 646 ounces of gold to buy the median price house. If you want to buy the median price house today in dollars, you're thinking that's $350,000 almost. That's a lot of money. But the fallacy is you're only measuring in dollars, right?
Right.
If you measure in gold, it's only 194 ounces of gold. So guess what? Your purchasing power of a house versus a dollar versus gold has been a winner if you're buying it in gold. And everybody listening and watching needs to understand that when they earn their money, when they earn their income, they're not forced to keep their income stored, or well, the part that they save, hopefully, right? They're not forced to keep that in dollars.
Exactly.
They could store that wealth in oil, gold, rice, orange juice, a whole host of things, Bitcoin, silver, platinum, palladium. There's just a myriad of things that you can use other than the dollar.
Right.
And many of these things withstand or hedge inflation much better than the dollar does.
Well, the dollar doesn't.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
The dollar doesn't at all.
Yeah, so that's for sure. So priced in gold, houses have gotten a lot cheaper over the years, cheaper than they were actually 51 years ago. Yet everybody thinks they're so expensive because they're only measuring in dollars.
Well, I know what I think, but I'm going to ask you what you think. Do you think this trend is going to continue and maybe even escalate?
Yeah, so, I really got into this comparison thing over the last few years. I always say to my audience, Lynette, maybe for the past, 6 or 7 years, compared to what? I always ask that question. And they've dubbed it the Jason Hartman question, compared to what? Now, clearly I did not invent the question, okay? But as I started thinking about it, I thought, I should develop an index, an economic index, a housing index that would measure the price of real estate versus a whole bunch of commodities that we all need to live. And in so doing, I created the HCI, the Hartman Comparison Index, and it measures 70 different commodities now. Okay, that's how big the index is currently. And some commodities, priced in some things, houses have become more expensive, and in others, they've become less expensive. And I'm happy to share more examples than just gold if you like.
Sure. I think everybody'd be interested in seeing that.
Good. The question is, priced in gold, is real estate cheap or expensive? It's very cheap. It's less than 1/3 of what it cost 51 years ago, 2 generations ago. Priced in Bitcoin, we can't go back very far, but it's much cheaper priced in Bitcoin. Okay, so we'll just leave that one. But, Bitcoin's highly speculative, right? The cryptocurrencies are very risky. They fluctuate like crazy, as we all know. But I think a good one to use is oil, because oil, no matter what anybody says, is arguably the most important commodity in the entire world. Forget about what the greenies say. The world runs on oil, folks. Okay,
that's not changing that quickly.
It's not changing anytime
soon.
soon.
That quickly.
And what's interesting, Lynette, is if anybody remembers back to the 70s again, remember all this fear of peak oil, right? There was all this talk, and you can look up peak oil, that phrase, in Wikipedia and read about it to understand it. They thought the world would run out of oil, but what they didn't count on was that humans, being very innovative, they invented new technologies to get more oil, right? And so, we use that now, and oil has become cheaper in some cases. But the world runs on oil. I would say it is the most important commodity on Earth, after, of course, oxygen and water. Okay, but we're not pricing that. Right. So in 1970, if you wanted to go back and buy that median price house, it would cost you 6,746 barrels, and a barrel's about 55 gallons, barrels of oil. So almost 7,000 barrels of oil to buy a house 51 years ago. If you fast forward that to just 10 years after that, in 1980, it only cost 2,043 barrels of oil to buy a house. Okay, so if you saved money in that 10-year period, denominated in oil or gold, you would have been much better 10 years later in 1980 buying a house in those commodities than in dollars. Your dollar got debased, but the commodities went up vis-a-vis the dollar, right? And by 2021, today, 4,600 barrels of oil to buy a house. So in 51 years, over 5 decades, it's now cheaper to buy a house priced in oil. And oil in 1970 was only $3 a barrel. Today it's $75 a barrel when we did this in June. That's our last pricing. So priced in oil, it's cheap, okay? So it's not cheap in everything, though. I can go with a bunch of examples, but I don't want to bore you. But I'll just say this. The next one is orange juice, okay? Orange juice is a commodity. It's traded globally. And priced in orange juice, housing has actually become a lot more expensive. So 51 years ago, it'd be 51,000 pounds of orange juice. And today, it's over 280,000 pounds of orange juice to buy a house. So these things are uneven.
Can I ask you a question in here? I'm wondering, do you do this with an entire food basket? Or do you do just the individual kind of things? Because that would be really interesting if there was a set standard food basket that most people buy.
That's a great idea. And we have priced it against a whole bunch of things. We toyed with the idea of pricing it against the CPI, but of course we all know the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is such a big lie.
Right.
It's so manipulated, that you can't even use it. So we've looked at a lot of that stuff. There are many food items in here. There are things like haircuts in the index. There are all sorts of things in it. We've got about 70 items in it now. And overall, just to bring this to a finality, I can say that priced in all of these things, when they are all averaged out and weighted and normalized, housing is still very cheap historically. And there's a stage 2 of the Hartman Comparison Index. And it is not talking about the price of the house, as we have been. It's talking about the payment on the house. And with these dysfunctionally toxic, artificially low interest rates, not that I have an opinion about this.
No, that's why I had you on here, because you have no opinions about anything.
I'm a teddy bear, no opinions at all.
Absolutely.
With those things, it is super cheap when you price the mortgage payment, the principal and interest payment. It is incredibly cheap. And by the way, I just want to state for the record, I would love nothing more than to see Bitcoin be the thing. A decentralized currency controlled by the people rather than central planners, I think would be awesome. I just don't know, because look, the two most powerful entities the world has ever known are governments and central banks, and they're not going to give up control easily.
Right. And now a lot of the fintech companies and those large companies, I mean, if there is indeed a finite number of Bitcoin, they own a lot of them.
Yeah.
Hello, Elon.
Yeah. Well, and Elon goes back and forth, and you see how volatile that is. Because when Elon makes a tweet, he can crash the price of Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that you can really do that kind of thing with gold when you've got a 5 millennia history from Egyptian times, right? You can't manipulate it as much. It has its manipulation.
You can with
sure.
the paper market.
Yeah, of course. And of course, GATA, the Gold Antitrust Action Committee, and all of that. I mean, look at everything's manipulated, okay?
Yeah, it really is.
There's some degree of manipulation in everything.
My concern is that if people, and I like fixed rate debt is fine, long as you have the ability to pay it off in a heartbeat when you need to. Because part of the plans, as I've read from the IMF, is to have all equity and all assets held in digital form and broken down. So if you have like 300,000 in equity in your home and it's held in digital form on your phone, but broken down into dollar bills, and then they know everything about you, right? And so they know how to inspire you to spend, then you end up spending your equity.
Or punish you because you wrote something bad online.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, it just gives them a whole lot more concern. For me, that's the function of gold, right? Because when they reset a currency, and you may not think the currency is going into reset, but then there's, do you think we're going into hyperinflation and reset? I should ask you
know,
that before I make that assumption.
yeah, hyperinflation doesn't really have like an academic definition. It's sort of like up to an opinion as to what that means, right? But will it be Zimbabwe or Hungary or Argentina style? I doubt it. I just think they're pretty good, and I don't mean this in a positive way, but they're pretty good at running a centrally planned economy. And that's not good for us. I'm just saying
I would say running a centrally planned economy into a wall.
Of course, but I don't think they will run it into a wall in such an intense fashion as has happened historically. The best way to control the population is to do that slowly. I mean, it's the old thing of how do you boil a frog, right? You put them in some nice, warm, comfortable water, you turn it up slowly. That's the plan. That's the best.
Well, that's what they've been doing.
Yeah.
And we'll see,
and
because
so
I
they'll turn
think
up
we're
the
at
heat a
the
little
end.
more and a little more.
Yeah. So back to the question, and I'll keep, everybody knows what my opinion is on that. So I'll just kind of keep that aside.
The debt
here.
question. Yeah.
Let's
do
just focus on the question.
Sure.
When we get into dire straits, and really like we saw in 2008 with homeowners that were underwater, right? And because the nominal prices on real estate has gone up, nobody is really underwater anymore. But if you don't have, how do you feel about having a means to pay that debt off should you need to? Because I think what they'll use is that crisis to say, well, okay, we're going to restructure your mortgage and we'll waive this or that as long as you agree to hold it, the equity in digital form.
Look, at the end of the day, they can do whatever they want.
Right.
Okay.
It's a fact.
We do have some checks and balances, but the trend is certainly in the direction of much more control over our lives, sadly. Okay.
Yes.
But it really goes back to the low-hanging fruit. They're going to do the easiest stuff first. And the easiest thing to do is cut stimulus checks, create inflation by incentivizing people not to work so the businesses have to compete with the government. I mean, I saw a sign the other day that Dollar General is now paying $20.75 per hour to work at Dollar General with a $500 signing bonus. McDonald's is paying $500 to $1,000 signing bonuses. Basically, these businesses are all being forced to compete with the government to get people to work, right? As far as that equity in your real estate, that is not low-hanging fruit. That's complicated for them. Now, granted, they could get there, but it's just not going to be the place they go first. I think the first place they will go is they'll go to the retirement accounts.
Oh, yeah.
And they'll attack that. They'll attack the cryptocurrency, the exchanges. They've already told all these exchanges, you got to know your customer just like the bank. And, they're making it really difficult. They examine blockchains all the time. They have investigators. That's like their whole career. So they're controlling all of that stuff. But when things are paper or digital versus physical, like real estate and gold, it's just much easier to control them. So that's the low-hanging fruit.
Did you mean that they're less easier to control when they're physical?
Easy to control when digital and paper, and hard to control when physical.
I agree.
Okay.
But do you think that people need to be prepared to pay that debt off in the next crisis when they go after that low-hanging? Because there'll be different low-hanging fruit in a crisis when people are freaking out, as we've seen.
Yeah. It changes. It's dynamic. You're absolutely right about that. I don't think I would worry too terribly much about that, and I'll tell you why. Having been in real estate for many decades now, and having, of course, been through the last crisis, which was 2008, all the people who did the wrong thing got the perks and the benefits, and all the people that did the right thing got screwed, okay? And it also happened before that during Hurricane Katrina, and it happens in every natural disaster. Think about it. So the right thing to do, at least it used to be the right thing to do, would be to live prudently, to pay for things in cash, and if you have to borrow, to pay them down quickly, and delay your gratification to own your things and pay your debts, right? But the new thing is, sadly, and I don't think it's right, I'm just saying it's the way it is that if you have a high mortgage balance, and I always say the best insurance is a high loan balance, because during any natural disaster, Katrina, an earthquake, whatever, FEMA will come along and give either free or low interest loans, and other government agencies like USDA will do that too. I remember during Katrina, the attorneys general for like 5 of the affected states told the lenders that they had to do a mortgage payment moratorium for 6 months, and they may have even extended that. I can't remember.
Well, we're in a mortgage moratorium now.
Well, that's a forbearance, a little different, but yes, you're right. But what I'm saying is, guess what happened to the people who were in the Katrina hurricane and paid their house off or had 50% equity, right? They got nothing. They got no, low interest anything. They couldn't get a refi and pull cash out. Real estate is a great asset, but it's not a great bank. It's better to keep your money in another asset, your wealth in that asset, like gold, for example, right? And have that because it's portable, it's not very trackable. I mean, look at all these other countries like Iran, right? I've had a lot of Persian people work for me over the years, and they all tell me stories. When they had, their uprising in the late 70s, right? They left with the jewelry on their body,
right,
and maybe a couple of pieces of gold in their pocket. They couldn't take their house with them. Maybe they took their car with them, but not for very long, okay?
Right.
You want to have your money in portable things. If a lender will lend you the money on the real estate, but you still get to control it, even though they've put most of the money into it, that's a great deal. And it's also a way to short the dollar through what I call inflation-induced debt destruction, where you're paying the mortgage back in cheaper dollars. So I like high loan balances on my properties. I think leverage is a very powerful tool with real estate. Of course, you have to use it responsibly.
Right, but you also have gold.
Yeah.
So, so if push came to shove and you made the choice to pay that off, especially in a reset, since that's what they reset the currency against, you would be able to pay that off.
Well, I don't have enough gold to pay off all my mortgages.
We need to talk.
I'll tell you that.
We really need to talk, and we need to talk about leverage, but we'll do that later.
I don't have that much gold. I have a lot of mortgages, okay? I have a lot of property. So the implicit option everybody has, this is the deal you all make with your lender when you borrow on a mortgage. The deal you make, the loan docs you sign say this. They say you pay the mortgage or you return the collateral. That's the deal, okay? So you can pay the mortgage, or if you don't pay the mortgage, eventually, and sometimes many years later, after living there for free for years, or having a tenant in there paying you rent, but you're not paying the lender for free for 3 years sometimes, even more I've heard, the implicit option you have is to just walk away.
Now, of course,
and that's what 12 million people did, by the way, during the Great Recession.
In 2008, and there are a lot of states that you can still do that, but there are other states that have changed the laws so that they can now attach other assets that you own to get the money that you owe them.
So the assets they're going to easily attach is bank accounts and brokerage accounts.
Absolutely.
Those are super easy to attach. In most states, and I'm not a lawyer, so check with counsel on things, of course.
Right.
But in most states, what's called purchase money loans on houses, meaning the loan is used to buy the house, right? Those are non-recourse. When you refinance the property and pull cash out of the property, that becomes a recourse loan where they can go after the borrower.
Oh, okay.
And that is legally true. However, in practice, they hardly ever do. I hardly ever hear a story of them going after the borrower. The lenders just want to get out and, sell the property and get what they can and move on most of the time. Because they got to do a full-fledged lawsuit to go after you like that. It's really hard.
Well, I agree with a lot, but we're living in unprecedented times, and it will be quite interesting to see what happens. And I know we're coming up on our time, but there is one question that I wanted to ask you before we close regarding interest rates. Because you mentioned earlier how Volcker pushed interest rates up to control the inflation that was happening as we were transitioning into this debt-based economy. Do you think they can push the interest rates up now? Do you think they will push the interest rates up?
Of course they can.
Well, they can, yes. Do you think they will?
I think Paul Volcker, the late Paul Volcker, is probably the last of the breed of people who really do the right thing. What he did, he suffered just mountains of criticism because it was tough. He made the country take the tough medicine, but he fixed the problem. Nowadays, nobody has the guts to fix the problem, Lynette. We live in an instant gratification world. Any kind of pain and suffering and hardship is just, it's just not acceptable. And you look at the two newest generations, the millennials and Generation Z, they're not going to be willing to tolerate that kind of thing. The idea of hardship today is someone offending you. That it's like ridiculous. Okay. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I would agree with that. However, when we look at that period of time, that was the beginning of the kickoff when, as you said, Nixon took us off the gold standard and handed full control of inflation to banks. Yeah. But the problem is, I could argue, yes, Paul Volcker forced us to take hard medicine, and I lived through that period of time. I had a 5-year, 15% CD. Yep. You're as old as I am?
Yep. Well, I don't need to be quite as old, but I'm not sure.
Well, that's true. Okay.
But, I remember my mom had a money market account that paid 16%.
Yeah.
She used to tell me about that. Yeah. So but, it's crazy. Yeah.
I could see that part of what he did was give the central bank ramp room inside of this, because during every crisis, here's the problem: during every crisis, they would drop interest rates about 5.5%, 5.75%. And then that would get everybody borrowing and spending again and keeping the party going. But right. They're out of that. This is really what the problem is. They're out of that tool. They can't drop interest rates 5%. They can't drop them 3%.
You're absolutely right.
Can't drop them 2%. We're in negative. We're already at negative real rates.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. In real terms, they're paying you to borrow it. So borrow as much as you can attached to assets, on fixed rate loans, not consumer borrowing, not credit card debt, none of that. Right. Okay, just borrowing against good assets. That's where you should borrow, like the big companies. And Lynette, before we wrap it up, I really do want to show you one last chart real quickly, because you're going to like this one, okay?
Okay.
And
you only get to show them if I like them.
Okay. Well, if you don't like it, your listeners will like it, okay? Remember, we talked not only about the price of the house compared to gold and other commodities, but how about the mortgage payment on the house? And here it is, okay? So back in 1970, and I'm just going to talk about gold here only, okay? I mean, barrels of oil are right next to it on the chart, and orange juice is right over here. But in gold, if you wanted to pay your mortgage payment in 1970, 5 decades ago, it would cost you 4.1 ounces of gold to pay your mortgage each month. So, for example, a lot of people were buying Krugerrands in the 70s, okay? And they were putting them in safe deposit boxes, and they'd drill a hole in them and wear them around their neck, right? And, people were gold crazy in the 70s for good reason.
Right.
The dollar was being debased,
right.
Okay? And so it would cost you 4.1 ounces of gold to pay your mortgage back then. And by 1980, it only cost 0.9 ounces to pay your mortgage. Less than an ounce. Less than 1/4 of what it cost 10 years earlier. Yet in dollars, it looked more expensive, but in gold, it was cheaper. Now, today, as of June of this year, it's only 0.7 ounces of gold to pay your mortgage. Mm-hmm. So in 51 years, your mortgage payment has been cut by more than 3/4. I mean, from 4.1 ounces to 0.7 ounces to pay your mortgage now. So it is an incredibly good time to be a borrower. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.